From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Carolyn Brown. I direct the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. And it gives me great pleasure, and I really mean great pleasure because I've heard our lecturer before, to welcome you here today for this lecture by John W. Kluge Jr. On a topic that should get everybody's interest. Why two in one flesh? The Western case for monogamy over polygamy. But before we begin, cell phones, if you would, please turn them off or turn them on to mute so they don't interfere with the program. Today's event is sponsored by the John W. Kluge Center, which was established through the generous endowment of John W. Kluge to create a scholarly venue here on Capitol Hill where the finest mature scholars might have an opportunity to, for informal conversation with policymakers and members of Congress. The idea was to bring together the world of ideas and the world of action in the days when we thought of politics in terms of action rather than inaction. The center supports also not only the senior scholars, but the rising generation of junior scholars who we expect over time will become some of the senior scholars, lead scholars at the center. We also offer a number of public programs such as this one and invite you, if you haven't already, to sign up for email notifications of our programs. There was a sign-up sheet as you came in the door, or pick up one of our brochures if you would like. I'm really pleased to have John Witte back with us today. I say back with us. We hope that he thinks of the Kluge Center as his sort of scholarly home away from home. He was here about 2 years ago working on another project as a distinguished visiting scholar, and then returned as the Cary and Ann Maguire Chair in Ethics and American History. And when we discovered how wonderful he was, we also snatched him for the Library Scholars Council. So he is a good friend. I'm sorry to say that Cary Maguire, the donor after which the chair is named, and who had planned to be here at this lecture, the odd time of 3 o'clock was to accommodate his schedule, and then for medical reasons he's not able to attend, but he will get the video. But I do want to say the purpose of the chair, because I think it will help you understand this important lecture. The chair was established to explore the history of America with special attention to the ethical dimensions of domestic economic, political, and social policies, with the goal of illuminating the responsible use of ethical knowledge for the public good. Responsible use of ethical knowledge for the public good. The subject, certainly, of marriage and relationship between the sexes is much a matter of discussion these days. We hear a lot about gay marriage, but part of what's interesting about today's talk is that there's beginning to be a discussion about monogamy and polygamy that's beginning to bubble up. Some television shows, Sister Wives and Big Love, begin to address the subject. Some recent feature articles that appeared in the National Geographic and the New Yorker. So something is bubbling under the surface. As John will probably note, although polygamy is still a crime in all 50 states, there's a growing cultural and constitutional pressure to remove at least the criminal prohibitions. So in such a context, it's really useful to think about What is the historical background for this? What are the arguments that have been advanced over the last 2,000 years in Western culture that might shed some light on this subject? And no one is better to address this than John Witte. When he's not here at the Library of Congress, which of course is most of the time, he is the Jonas Robitscher Professor of Law, Alonzo L. McDonald Distinguished Service Professor, and Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He's a prolific scholar, has published at least 26 books, 220 articles, journals, symposia. His major areas of inquiry are legal history, religious liberty, marriage and family law, and human rights. And to these issues, he brings a deep, as you'll see, historical grounding and rich knowledge of Christianity and all the tools of the legal trade, legal history and analysis. I think I will, this introduction is going a little bit long, I'll skip some of the names of his various books, but I invite you after the lecture to do a Google search and you'll get a sense of the variety, depth, and prolificness of his output. In addition to those things, I'll just note, he has directed 12 major international research projects on these various subjects. So it's not just his own research in the book, but bringing together a range of scholars who consider these issues. And the young people in the audience will particularly appreciate this. He's won prizes for his teaching 11 times. The Emory Law students have voted him as the most outstanding professor. So I know we're in for a treat, as we always are when John speaks. And please welcome our friend and colleague, John Witte Jr.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for your warm and very generous introduction. It's wonderful to see all of you. Thank you so much for coming out on a misty day and participating in a little conversation about a controversial issue of polygamy. It's wonderful to be back in my scholarly home, away from home, and have a chance again to enjoy the wonderful hospitality and generous conversations with my colleagues in the Kluge Center in the library. I've been here a couple of times, as Dr. Brown indicated, and each time I've enjoyed the rich conversations over lunch informally, the wonderful collections in the law library and the general library, the opportunity to sit with experts from around the world doing different interesting things and learning from them. This is a scholar's paradise here, and it's a wonderful place where a scholar can immerse him or herself and learn something new, and I have been doing that with some alacrity. And I'm a little intimidated to be talking to you already now because I haven't finished my book yet on why two in one flesh, the Western case for monogamy over polygamy. I'm in the middle of it, and I'm learning, and it's a little intimidating to start talking in front of a distinguished audience about these topics. And as I was musing about my lecture today, I couldn't help but remember the rather embarrassing experience of my good friend Brian in our first-year class in contracts together some 25 years ago when I was a first-year law student. The class was taught by the Venerable Archibald Cox of Watergate fame, a master of Socratic dialogue and repartee. Brian was a particularly gifted student. He had been trained in rhetoric and drama at Radcliffe College. He'd been a national debating champion. He'd also been a professional actor, appearing in a part on Broadway plays. And so when Professor Cox called on Brian to recite the first case of the day in contracts, Brian held forth with considerable aplomb. Cox, of course, had only begun his interrogation, and he began to press his line of questions a little more closely, and Brian found that the answers did not fall nearly so easily off his tongue. Cox became more insistent, now lashing out his Socratic whip with increasing alacrity and increasing accuracy. Brian became more and more confused. Cox became even more insistent. And finally, when the questions threatened to overwhelm him, Brian summoned up the little courage he had left, pulled himself up, looked Professor Cox straight in the eye, and repeated a line from his drama days. "Sir, I am afraid I am teetering on the edge of the abyss of my ignorance." Cox's reply was instantaneous. "Young man, you fell into that abyss some time ago." Well, standing here musing about issues of polygamy in front of this distinguished audience, I too am teetering on the edge of the abyss of my ignorance, and I shall leave it to Dr. Brown to declare when I have fallen in. A century and a half ago, Mormons made national headlines by claiming the religious right to practice polygamy despite federal criminal laws against it. In 4 cases from 1879 to 1890, the U.S. Supreme Court firmly rejected their claims. Part of the court's argument was historical. The common law has always defined marriage as monogamous, and to change those rules would be, quote, a return to barbarism, unquote. Part of the court's argument was prudential. Religious liberty can never become a license to violate general criminal laws, lest chaos ensue. And part of the court's argument was sociological. Monogamous marriage is, quote, the cornerstone of Western civilization, and it cannot be moved without upending our whole culture. Contemporaneous courts in Europe were equally dismissive of polygamous claims, and these old cases remain the law of the West. Most Mormons renounced polygamy in 1890, and in 1906 made it a ground for excommunication from the church. The question of religious polygamy is back in the headlines, now involving a Mormon splinter group that has retained the church's traditional polygamous practices. The fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, as this group are called, rejected the mainline Mormon church's departure from its traditional polygamous teachings and practices. They regard polygamy as a central religious practice, conducive, if not essential, to salvation. Seeking to escape social stigma and criminal prosecution, the fundamentalist saints withdrew into small, isolated, largely religious communities scattered throughout the thinly populated Western states. Today, the church's membership in America is around 60-odd thousand. These fundamentalist saints, as Dr. Brown indicated, are now coming into the public eye. National Geographic had a cover story and major television feature on them in 2010. Popular shows like Sister Wives and Big Love and popular magazines like People and Time are making the polygamous lifestyle look mainstream, even edgy, glamorous, something you may want to try to do on occasion. But the legal reality is that polygamy is still a crime in every state, and those who practice it risk going to prison. This is precisely what happened in April 2008 when state authorities raided a fundamentalist saints community in El Dorado, Texas, called the Yearning for Zion Ranch. The authorities were acting on preliminary evidence that underage girls were being forced into sex and spiritual marriages with men 2 or 3 or 4 times their age. They eventually removed 439 children from the ranch and put them into temporary state protective custody. They found a dozen girls aged 12 to 15 who had been forced into marriages. 7 of them had already given birth to their first child. They found 262 other minor children who were victims or witnesses to statutory rape or sexual child abuse. 11 men were eventually charged with polygamy, sexual assault, and various kinds of child abuse. And they were all convicted, with punishments ranging from 7 to 75 years. Warren Jeffs, the presiding prophet over this community, is now serving life imprisonment for his crimes and participation in this exercise. Many of the legal questions raised by the Texas ranch case are easy. Coerced marriages, statutory rape, sexual assault, and other abuses of children are all serious crimes. The adults on the ranch who committed these crimes have no claim to religious freedom that will excuse them, and no claim to privacy that will protect them. Dealing with children, ensuring proper procedures, sorting out the evidence are all practically messy and emotionally trying questions, but they are not very legally hard. The harder legal question is whether criminalizing polygamy is still constitutional. Texas criminal law makes marriage to 2 persons at once a felony, a first-degree felony if one of the parties is younger than 16. Every other American state has comparable criminal prohibitions on the books. Can these criminal laws against polygamy withstand a challenge that they violate an individual's constitutional rights to privacy and sexual liberty, to marriage and domestic autonomy, to equal protection and non-discrimination, in addition to these rights to religious freedom? In the 19th century, when the first Mormon cases reached the federal courts on religious liberty grounds alone, none of these additional constitutional rights claims was yet available to pro-polygamy litigants. Now they are, and the U.S. Supreme Court has used them for the past half-century to uphold every adult citizen's rights to consensual sex, non-marital cohabitation, divorce, contraception, abortion, and sodomy. Do Texas and other states have strong enough grounds to uphold their traditional criminal prohibitions against polygamy when such constitutional claims are made, especially if made by a party with deep religious convictions? May a religious polygamist at least get a religious liberty exemption from compliance with these laws. That would make polygamy a tolerated practice for these religious parties, a de facto form of marriage, as we lawyers like to call it. The state would not prosecute them for polygamy, but the state would also not enforce their polygamous marriage contracts, provide them with family services or protections, or accord the spouses any of the thousands of rights and privileges available to state-recognized marriages and families. No state burdens, no state benefits. Polygamous families and their religious communities under this arrangement would become, in effect, a law unto themselves. That raises a still harder legal question, whether a state legislature should go further by not only decriminalizing polygamy, but legalizing it as a valid marriage option for its citizens. In one sense, this move from toleration to recognition, from de facto to de jure polygamy, seems like a rather small step. After all, American states today, viewed together, already offer several models of state-sanctioned domestic life for their citizens: straight and gay marriage, contract and covenant marriage, civil unions, domestic partnerships, and more. Each of these off-the-rack models of domestic life have built-in rights and duties that the parties have to each other and to their children and to their dependents. And the parties can further tailor these built-in rights and duties through private prenuptial contracts. With so much marital pluralism and private ordering already available, why not add a further option, that of polygamous marriage? Why not give to polygamous families the same status afforded to other domestic unions recognized by state law? Wouldn't that be better than consigning polygamists to a shadow marriage world, controlled by religious authorities who have none of the due process constraints imposed upon the states and their authorities? These questions are not unique to the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. In the United States, various Muslim, Vietnamese, Hmong, Native American groups, alongside various emigres from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, have been quietly practicing polygamy under the supervision of religious and cultural leaders. A few enterprising pastors and imams in the inner cities are quietly condoning polygamy to help the vast numbers of single mothers and fatherless children in their congregations who need support and protection. A number of polygamist and polyamorous communities have emerged, some on the libertarian right, more on the critical left, claiming the rights to sexual self-determination and extolling the virtues of multiple partners joining in sexual intimacy and in the communal care of each other and their children. State authorities generally will move on these polygamous groups today only if they engage in other criminal activities like coerced or child marriages, or if they seek to engage in social welfare or insurance fraud to support their multiple wives and children. The status of polygamy by itself is just an aggravant, making the punishment for those other offenses more serious. But by itself, it's rarely prosecuted today. And the same thing tends to be true in Western Europe and other parts of the West. It's possible that Western polygamy prohibitions will just become dead letters on the books, like the traditional sex crimes of fornication and adultery, which have just withered away, now simply celebrated in the media. But it's more likely that the constitutionality of polygamy will become the next hot legal topic on the order of contraception, abortion, sodomy, and same-sex marriage. If current case law in the UK, on the continent, in Canada, and elsewhere are any indication, the West will soon have to face this issue squarely. I come to our subject as a legal historian, with a special interest in the development of Western norms of sex, marriage, and family life, and the development of human rights and religious freedom in the West. And the question I'm trying to answer in this ever thicker book that the Maguire Chair has so generously enabled me to write is simply this: what is the Western case against polygamy? And do these traditional arguments against polygamy still hold up in our postmodern, post-Christian, rapidly globalizing society? Is polygamy just another one of those stubborn, traditional Christian sex crimes, inevitably vulnerable to the same constitutional logic of privacy and sexual liberty that toppled traditional laws against abortion or contraception or sodomy? Are defenders of anti-polygamy laws just like the prudish patriarchs and chauvinists and homophobes, clutching to their traditional morality at the cost of true liberty for all? I want to invite you, perhaps heroically, to suspend that present-day judgment for a few moments and join me on a little tour of the historical record that this fabulous Library of Congress allows anybody with a little time to take. It turns out that this is not just another tour of the tried and tired dialectic of traditional Christian morality versus modern constitutional liberty. For unlike many traditional sex crimes that have been constitutionally eclipsed today, the prohibition against polygamy is both pre-Christian in origin and post-Christian in orientation. Pre-Christian in that the Bible has no clear prohibition against polygamy anywhere, and the Bible includes more than a dozen polygamist patriarchs amongst the early titans of the faith. Pre-Christian furthermore because the Christian church was rather slow to ban polygamy, even though it quickly condemned many other sexual practices of the Greco-Roman world in which it was born. It was the pagan Roman emperors and Germanic kings who first criminalized polygamy long before they established Christianity and long before the church issued comparable prohibitions. The church eventually made some of these anti-polygamous sentiments a part of its theology, ethics, and canon law, but the reality is that Christianity was much more a carrier than an inventor of the West's aversion to polygamy, and its normative stands against polygamy were as much philosophical as theological in argument. Because of this, the West's aversion to polygamy also eventually became post-Christian. Long after they disestablished Christianity, Western nations remained firmly opposed to polygamy. Indeed, some of the strongest Western arguments against polygamy came from 18th and 19th century Enlightenment liberals and common lawyers who rejected Christianity sometimes ruefully, but regarded polygamy as a betrayal of reason, nature, fairness, utility, and common sense, drawing their arguments, it turns out, directly from Christian writers before them. And their arguments are now at the heart of the modern liberal, feminist, and human rights critique of polygamy. So let's spend a little time rummaging around in some library dust to see how we got from there to here. Let me spend a bit of time just telling you about the emerging laws of polygamy and then sample a few of the main arguments, especially in their genesis, that have emerged in support of the anti-polygamy stand of the West. For more than 2,500 years, the Western legal tradition has defined marriage as the union of one man and one woman who have the fitness, capacity, and freedom to marry each other. Two in one flesh, as the Bible puts it. The two halves of humanity restored, as the ancient Greek poets put it. While monogamous marriage is neither good for everyone nor always good, Western writers have long argued, in general and in most cases, monogamous marriage brings essential private goods to the married couple and their children and vital public goods to society and the state. These goods of monogamous marriage have been celebrated by everyone from Aristotle and Plutarch in ancient days to Patrick Moynihan in the CDC in our day. And today, in some states and nations, these marital goods are being extended to same-sex monogamous couples as well. For nearly as long, the Western legal tradition has also denounced polygamy. We have fragmentary laws against polygamy already in Greece and Rome in the 5th and 4th century before the Common Era. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Roman law clearly called polygamy nefarious and infamous. The first empire-wide Roman criminal statute against polygamy that has survived is from 258 of the Common Era, half a century before Constantine, the first Christian emperor. That imperial edict was directed against Jewish and pagan polygamy, which persisted in some quarters of the empire, and against the new habit of some Roman citizens to keep wives in different cities, or 2 or more wives at home as sex objects or as status symbols. A man may have 1 fiancée or 1 wife at a time, the edict said, no more. Later Roman emperors and Germanic kings, both Christian and non-Christian, repeated these earlier Roman law edicts against polygamy, each time escalating the punishment. By the 6th century, polygamy was grounds for whipping, banishment, and enslavement. By the 9th century, it was a capital crime, viewed as a form of perpetual adultery. These first millennium laws passed into the civil law of the continent, the common law of England, and the canon law of the church, and they were prosecuted in church and state courts alike, including by the Inquisition. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe and its colonies rejuvenated these capital criminal laws against polygamy in response to the polygamous experiments of a few early Anabaptist Protestants and the polygamous habits of some of the indigenous groups encountered in the colonies. Still another wave of firm new criminal laws and prosecutions broke out in 19th century America as a reaction to the polygamy of Mormons, Native American Indians, Asian immigrants, and some emancipated slaves who retained African customs. Polygamy then became a non-capital crime, but brazen polygamists still faced long prison sentences and massive property confiscations. These laws remain on the books to this day throughout the West and beyond. Every state in the U.S., every country in Western Europe, every nation in the British Commonwealth and in Latin America still formally criminalizes polygamy, with occasional concessions given to Aboriginal peoples. So now do Russia and China and non-Muslim sections of India that have taken over these Western laws in the past half-century. These traditional Western laws against polygamy have sundry rationales, but 2 main arguments, the argument from harm and the argument from nature, have proved to be the most enduring and the most effective. And I'd like to spend a little time trying to rummage through those early arguments. The most persistent Western argument against polygamy is that it too often is the cause and the consequence of harm. Harm to women, harm to children, harm to men, harm to society, harm to the state. A few early Roman jurists and Greek philosophers already touched on this argument before the turn of the Common Era, but it was the Church Fathers in the 2nd through the 6th century of the Common Era who first gave it prominence. The Church Fathers were focused on the polygamy of the Hebrew Bible. The Bible reports on 17 polygamists in ancient Israel, both before and after the giving of the Torah. The list includes some titans of the faith, such as Abraham and Jacob and David and Solomon. But the Bible also reports that their polygamy was associated with sundry crimes and harms. The Hebrew Bible term for co-wife, zara, literally means trouble, and trouble there was in abundance, said the fathers. Take the biblical story of Jacob, a veritable biblical soap opera. The Bible records that Jacob's uncle Laban had tricked him into marrying his elder daughter Leah instead of Rachel, whom Jacob loved. Jacob had reluctantly married Leah, and later he married her sister Rachel as well. After his second marriage, Jacob disliked Leah, but evidently not enough to stop sleeping with her, for she produced 12 sons for him. Jacob loved and doted on Rachel to the point of fault, but she produced no children. Leah thus lorded her fertility over Rachel. Incensed, Rachel gave Jacob her maidservant as a concubine in the hopes of having at least a surrogate child. Jacob obliged Rachel and produced 2 sons by her servant. Leah countered by giving Jacob her maidservant as a second concubine, with whom Jacob sired yet another son. He was a busy man. All the while, Jacob continued to sleep with Rachel, who finally conceived and had a son, Joseph. This only escalated the feud between Rachel and Leah and the children of them and the children of their concubines. The pathos continued in the next generation. Jacob and Leah's first son, Reuben, had repeated sex with his mother-in-law. Another of their sons, Judah, had sex with his daughter-in-law, whom he mistook as a prostitute. Both of them and their brothers sold their half-brother Joseph, the son of Jacob and Rachel, into slavery. For the church fathers, the Bible records all of this pathos as a poignant illustration of the harms that are associated with polygamy. Fraud, trickery, jealousy, rivalry, intrigue, incest, concubinage, adultery, lust, which begat even more polygamy, prostitution, kidnapping, and more. Even the great King David brought grave harm to his household and his whole kingdom through his polygamy, the fathers continued. Though he already had an ample harem of wives and concubines, King David lusted after another woman named Bathsheba, who was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. David first seduced Bathsheba, during her period no less. He then arranged to have her husband Uriah killed and took Bathsheba as his wife. Other troubles followed. David's son Amnon, by another wife, lusted after his half-sister Tamar, the daughter of yet a third wife. Tamar befriended Amnon, but when she refused his sexual advances, Amnon raped Tamar to her great shame and grief. Tamar's full brother Absalom was outraged and eventually had Amnon murdered. This set off a bitter feud within King David's household, which eventually spilled into civil war and David's exile. Eventually, this warfare led to the infamous death of Absalom as well, much to David's grief. And when David later died, still more hardship followed as his sons fought to the death for his throne and inheritance. Here we see again, said the church fathers, that polygamy comes with fraud and trickery and jealousy and rivalry, intrigue, concubinage, lust, seduction, adultery, and other impurities, now compounded by rape and incest and murder and even civil war. And all this within the household of one of the greatest figures in the history of the Bible. For the church fathers and for the Western legal tradition thereafter, these biblical stories of woe were proof enough that polygamy was inherently dangerous and harmful and must be avoided. If the greatest titans in the Bible cannot contain the harms of polygamy, nobody else should even try. Every time polygamy became an issue, Western writers would return to these early patristic writings about the inherent harms of polygamy. In the Middle Ages, the polygamy that attracted their attention was not so much that of the biblical patriarchs as that of the present-day Muslims, who pressed with alacrity on the edges of Western Christendom. Scores of medieval writers took up their pens and some took up their swords against Muslim polygamy, while shoring up the Western theology and law of monogamous marriage as well. One of the fullest critiques of Muslim polygamy came from an obscure theologian, William of Orange, who later became Bishop of Paris in the early 13th century. Before his episcopal succession, William had been a military chaplain amongst the Crusaders in the Holy Land. There he observed the polygamous practices of local Muslim families. There he interviewed sultans and various heads of households. Thereafter he interviewed a number of other Crusaders who came back. And all of what he heard troubled him deeply. And when he returned to Paris, he set out a detailed argument against what he called the bent love of polygamy. And this is an text in the development of the Western case. Nobody knows about it. It's sitting right over there in the library. William started with the proposition that nature puts females and males in the human species at about the same level. Sometimes males, sometimes females die by disease or by the sword beyond the intention of nature, he wrote. Sometimes there are more men than women who choose the celibate religious life. Sometimes it's the other way around, but in the usual course, there is one man for each woman. Polygamy, by definition, upsets this natural balance of 1-to-1 sex ratio, said William. For inevitably, if one powerful or wealthy polygamist hoards more than his natural share of women, that will leave other men in sharper competition for the fewer women who are left. Some men will inevitably lose out altogether and will resort to violence and fraud and intrigue, as well as to prostitution, adultery, rape, and abduction, all to the harm of existing families and especially to vulnerable girls and women. Natural equity thus commends monogamy over polygamy, said William. Moreover, William continued, polygamous households can become independent powers that rival and distort the legitimate political power that should be emerging. Aristotle, said William, had properly seen that the household is the foundation of the polis, and Aristotle, together with the Bible, had properly defined this household to be monogamous, 2 in one flesh, not 3 or 4. What a nest is among pair-bonding birds is what a house is among humans, William argued. Just as one male and one female hatch their young in one nest, eventually producing a flock of birds that mingle and migrate together, so only one man and one woman generate in each house, and their children eventually generate in their own. Monogamous marriage, said William, respects the limits and the constrictions of each household, so that their eventual collection yields an organized and governable community. By contrast, polygamous households do not try to build a house before a city, but a city within a house, said William. And this is just developmentally backwards, he said, and inevitably results in the perpetuation of rival families and tribes, not the development of a well-governed and well-organized civilization. While some polygamous households become rival independent powers, William continued, just as many of them fail miserably, to the great harm of wives and children. The wives themselves must deal largely on their own with the great pain of childbirth, the unhappiness of other pregnant and nursing women, the hard work and misery in feeding and tending to their children without enough resources to help them. The man, in turn, must work doubly hard to try to support all these women and children with inevitable favoritism of some and neglect, scorn, and rivalry amongst the others. It's obvious, wrote William, that even the most powerful and wealthy man cannot provide effectively for so many wives and children. A rational and a calculating man will understand this reality, of course, he continued. And that man will either spill his seed upon the ground for fear of yet another pregnancy, a major sin in his day, or he will induce the abortion of an unwanted child from an unfavored mother. Or if a less than perfect child comes forth, or one that he cannot support, the man will smother it upon birth or sell it into slavery or prostitution with modest prospects of its survival. Finally, William argued, polygamy sometimes harms the man of the house too. Not only will his energies and resources be dissipated upon so many competing women and children with their heavy demands upon him, not only will the prospect of adding new women to his harem inevitably and perennially inflame his lust for more, see King David, but ultimately the excessive lust and sex that is endemic to a polygamist's life will actually decrease rather than increase the man's fertility, Williams concluded. Reflecting a common biological belief of his day, he wrote, "The more a polygamist man copulates, the less fertile he becomes." Williams' argument, tucked away in this early text, would become a pervasive and permanent part of the Western case against polygamy. Medieval and early modern canonists, civilians, and common lawyers alike repeated and embroidered these arguments endlessly. This was not just a Christian theological quarrel with Muslims. This was a general legal argument against a form of reproduction that was considered to be inherently harmful, regardless of who practiced it or why they believed in it. These arguments also became a staple of the Enlightenment liberal case, denouncing the polygamy that Western nations were encountering in the colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Jefferson, Madison, and many other famous Enlightenment liberals pressed this argument almost in exactly these terms. David Hume, Francis Hutchinson, Adam Smith, and others were particularly effective in transmitting it to the United States. Thomas Jefferson speaks for many when he says that Polygamy exists around the world only, quote, where women are treated as inferior beings, and where men of wealth transgress every rule of temperance by buying their wives like slaves and by adopting the savage manners of animals. Polygamy might be the habit of the barbarian or the fancy of the lustful libertine, said Jefferson, but it is not and cannot be the practice of a civilized people. Today, anthropologists, psychologists, and human rights lawyers alike use variations on this same ancient argument from harm to criticize polygamy. Young women, they argue, are harmed because they're too often coerced into early marriages with older men. Once pushed aside for a rival co-wife, women are reduced to slaves within the household. They are then exploited periodically for sex or for procreation and for household labor. They are forced to make do for themselves and their children with dwindling resources, as still other women and children are added to the household against their wishes. If they protest their plight, if they resort to self-help, if they lose their youthful figure and vigor, they and their children are often cast out of their homes, impoverished, undereducated, and often incapable of survival without serious help from others. Children are harmed, the argument continues, because they are often set in perennial rivalry with other children and mothers for the affection and the attention of the family patriarch. They are deprived of healthy models of authority and liberty, equality and charity, marital love and fidelity, which are essential to their development as future spouses, citizens, and community leaders. And they are harmed by too few resources to support their nurture, education, care, and preparation for a full and healthy life as an adult. And men are harmed by polygamy. Polygamy promotes marriage by the richest, not necessarily the fittest men, in body, mind, and virtue. In isolated communities, polygamy often leads to the ostracism of younger men, the lost boys who resort to abduction, prostitution, and other destructive behavior. Polygamy inflames a man's lust, for once he adds a second wife, he will inevitably desire more, even the wife of another. And polygamy deprives men of that essential organic bond of exclusive marital companionship, friendship, and love, which ancients and moderns alike say is critical to most men's physical, psychological, moral, and some would say spiritual health. The argument from harm was often accompanied by a second argument against polygamy, the argument from nature. Natural arguments against polygamy have always been a more divisive topic in the Western tradition. The church fathers had split on this issue. Fathers of peerless repute like Ambrose and Basil had condemned polygamy as unnatural, abominable, a beastly thing, a violation of natural law. Other fathers of equal orthodoxy like Augustine and Chrysostom had said that polygamy was perfectly natural, in full compliance with the natural law. These differences of opinion have continued into early modern and modern conversations. And today, the natural law argumentation is always dismissed as static, perfectionist cover for predetermined dogmatic judgments. But it's a different argument from nature. First formulated by Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar in the 13th century, that had a wider and more enduring appeal for the Western case against polygamy. And this was an argument about the natural pair bonding strategies of procreation that humans had developed to compensate for several peculiar sexual, reproductive, and developmental tendencies. One of these peculiar tendencies, said Aquinas, is that humans, unlike most other animals, crave sex all the time, especially when they're young and most fertile. They don't have a short rutting or mating season followed by a long period of sexual quietude. They're constantly ready to have sex, especially men. Another peculiarity is that human babies, unlike the young of most other animals, are born weak, fragile, and utterly dependent for many years. They're not ready to run or swim or fly away upon birth or shortly thereafter. They need food and shelter and clothing and education, and that for a very long time. Without it, they will certainly die. Most human mothers, said Aquinas, have a hard time caring fully for the children on their own, especially if they already have several others. They need help, especially from the fathers and the kin networks that the fathers represent. But most fathers, Aquinas continued, will bond and help with a child only if they're certain of their paternity. Put a baby cradle on a sidewalk, said Aquinas, and most women will stop out of natural empathy. Most men will walk by unless they're unusually charitable. Once assured of their paternity, however, most men will bond deeply with their children, help with their care and support, and defend them at great sacrifice, for they will see their children as a continuation and an extension of themselves, of their name, their property, their teachings, of their bodies, their beings, their genes, we would say today. Here is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. Given these peculiarities, said Aquinas, nature has strongly inclined rational human beings to develop enduring and exclusive sexual relationships called marriages as the best form and forum of sexual bonding and reproductive success. Faithful and healthy monogamous marriages, said Aquinas, are designed to provide for the sexual needs and desires of husband and wife alike. They ensure that both fathers and mothers are certain that a child born to them is theirs. They ensure that husband and wife will together care for, nurture, and educate their children until they mature. And they deter both spouses from destructive sexual behavior outside the home. Even so, said Aquinas, our natural human inclinations toward monogamy remain wobbly, for the natural law is not self-executing. It needs the positive laws of the state to help teach and enforce these natural norms for monogamy and against polygamy. These positive laws must reject polyandry, said Aquinas, one female with multiple husbands, because this practice is naturally unjust to children. If a woman has sex with several husbands, Aquinas argued, it removes the likelihood that the children born to that woman will clearly belong to any one of the husbands. This will undermine paternal certainty and consequent paternal investment in that child's care. The children will suffer from neglect, and the wife will be overburdened trying to care for them and trying to tend to her multiple husbands and their rampant sexual needs at once. These positive laws must also reject polygyny, one male with multiple wives, because this practice is unjust to wives, said Aquinas. Polygyny does not necessarily erode paternal certainty, Aquinas allowed. So long as his multiple wives are faithful to him alone, a man could be assured of being the father of children born in his household. But this required a man to pen up his wives like cattle, isolating them from other roving males, even when his own energies to tend to them were already dissipated over several women and children gathered in the household. While locked up at home, the wives are reduced to servants and set in perennial competition with each other for resources and access to their shared husband. This is not marriage, this is slavery, said Aquinas, now repeating the argument from Harm. It betrays the fundamental requirement of fidelity and mutuality between a husband and a wife, the undivided and undiluted love and friendship that becomes a proper marriage. True marital faith and friendship consists in equality that should never be divided over more than one, Aquinas wrote. It requires not only foregoing sexual intercourse with another and honoring the reasonable sexual advances of one spouse, it also requires the commitment to be indissolubly united with one's spouse in body and mind, to be willing to share fully and equally in that person, property, lineage, and reputation of one's spouse. Natural law and the positive law that is built upon it, as a consequence, favors the monogamous form over the polygamous form. To these natural arguments, Aquinas and others added theological arguments that marriage is an exclusive and enduring union modeled on the mysterious union of Christ and his church, Yahweh and his chosen people. This strengthened his case for the exclusive and indissoluble monogamous marriages of Christians. But even stripped of its theological overlay, Aquinas' argument from nature alone was powerful. It was also enduring. literally hundreds of later jurists and philosophers, Catholic, Protestant, and post-Christian liberals alike, repeated these arguments to defend monogamy and to denounce polygamy. And today, a number of anthropologists and evolutionary scientists have argued that enduring pair bonding is the most expedient means for humans to reproduce, given the realities of long and demanding human-infant dependency and the perennial sex drives of fertile humans. Indeed, human reproduction by enduring pair bonding is described by evolutionary scientists from Claude Levi-Strauss to Bernard Chappé as the deep structure of survival that the human species has evolved. In his own pre-scientific way, Aquinas saw this already 750 years ago. Yes, he called it the human nature that God has created, rather than a reproductive survival strategy that the human species has evolved, but the conclusion is the same, that monogamy is ultimately better than polygamy for human reproduction and flourishing. There is much more to be said about the Western case against monogamy, and I have a lot more thinking to do about whether this case holds up for our modern day. But my preliminary thought is that these two arguments that we have sampled support the intuitive notion that many Western people share, that polygamy is just somehow inherently wrong. Malum in se, we law professors put it. Many states legislate against a number of activities that are considered to be malum in se, evil in themselves. Slavery, indentured servitude, gambling, prostitution, obscenity, bestiality, incest, sex with minors, self-mutilation, organ selling, and more, just because those activities are wrong or because they at least will inevitably foster wrongdoing. That someone wants to engage in these activities voluntarily for reasons of bravery or religion or custom or autonomy makes no real difference. That other cultures, past and present, allow such activities also makes no real difference. For 2+ millennia, the Western tradition has included polygamy amongst the crimes that it considers to be inherently wrong. Not just because polygamy is unbiblical or unusual or unsafe or unsavory, though sometimes it is, but also because polygamy routinizes patriarchy, jeopardizes consent, fractures fidelity, divides loyalty, dilutes devotion, fosters inequity, promotes rivalry, foments lust, condones adultery, confuses children, and much more. Not in every case, to be sure, but in enough cases to make the practice of polygamy too risky to condone. Furthermore, allowing religious polygamy as an exception to the rules is even more dangerous, because it will make some churches and some mosques a law unto themselves. Again, some religious communities and their members might well thrive with the freedom to practice polygamy. But inevitably closed repressive regimes like the Texas Ranch compound will also emerge, with underage girls duped or coerced into sex and marriages with older men, with women and children trapped in sectarian communities with no realistic access to help or protection from the state, and no real legal recourse against a church or a mosque that is just following its own internal rules. We prize liberty, equality, and consent in America and in the rest of the West too highly to court such a risk. If you're not sure, just ask some of those moms and kids on the Texas ranch. Thank you very much. So now the fun part starts. Have I fallen into the abyss, I guess, is the first question. Questions, comments, please, sir.
I'm a sociologist. And it seems to me that your whole argument is, shall we say, sociology, maybe sociology-anthropology. And specifically, it's functionalism. And I trained under Talcott Parsons, who was a famous functionalist at Harvard, but functionalism has fallen into considerable disarray and been criticized rather roundly. And my question to you is, you seem to have rested your argument mostly on philosophy and religion more than on sociology and anthropology. I wonder, have you investigated what both of those disciplines say about all this, particularly, for instance, Monroe Edmondson, who said some very interesting things about the incest taboo, which is kind of related to all this. And are you going to incorporate that kind of argumentation, both the arguments for your conclusions coming out of functionalism, and then you also have to deal with the attacks on it coming out of the attacks on functionalism?
Thank you. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a consumer of those literatures, albeit as a mere novice. What I was reporting is how the Western legal tradition has taken the consequences of a functionalist sociology, however more of them today, and used it to devise an argument, first of all, from harm. The argument from harm being the worry that in those polygamous communities that have emerged historically, in the experiments of polygamy that intermittently emerge in the Western tradition, in every instance, the incidences of harm outweigh the benefits of that polygamous conversation that emerges. And it's that derivative understanding of functional social science that I'm trying to report on. There are many other arguments in the tradition that have emerged alongside these. Fancy theological arguments about the mysterious union of Christ and His church, a number of important arguments about the worry about women's rights and children's rights that are articulated exactly in those terms, worries about inheritance, worries about the welfare net, worries about a number of other things beyond what functional psychology and sociology has given us, but they're part of the story. Yes, I have been reading some of the new literature, both for and against polygamy, as it emerges in the 20th and 21st century sociological and anthropological literature. It's, as you know better than I, a mixed bag. Some people that have reported on the presence of polygamy in different communities report on the incidences of harm that I've articulated, especially looking at the West and the experiments with polygamy in the West. The worry is the kind of Texas compound, the Texas ranch case, is not so unusual. The worry is the rampant social welfare fraud, the lost boys problem, the difficulty of social welfare cases that begin to emerge rapidly from these communities, the worries of escape, the worries of mini-theocracies, all seem to be part of the sociological and anthropological assessment of the presence of polygamous communities in the West. Now, the question becomes, is this just a function of the illegality of those communities? That is, if you give them the opportunity to live full and robust lives, if you take them out of the shadows, if you give them freedom from the threat and coercion of being prosecuted at any given time, if you give them the full range of benefits that the state affords to a number of other kinds of domestic unions, will those communities flourish better? I think that's a question that the sociologists and anthropologists have spent a good bit of time conversing together. Final thing I would say is that there is a new kind of, I'm not sure what it is, and you can tell me what exactly it is in the current sociology world. There's kind of a new kind of interviewing narrative sociology that's gone on, engineered in part by human rights lawyers, engineered in part by feminists and people looking at alternative family theories, and it's a simple entrance into these communities and interviewing of wives and children and asking them exactly what they're experiencing, what's happening there, being careful and living with them and getting a sense of what they're about. And that has thrown up a bigger mixed bag, and that's given lawyers, criminal lawyers in particular, pause. Because if in point of fact the current data of the experience of polygamous communities is actually not as bad as it's made out to be, if the caricatures rather than the characterizations of these communities are such that actually people that enter into these communities are not coerced, they're given the opportunity to leave, and they enjoy it, what does that do for these norms? And I think that is going to be the big challenge. And whether this is functionalist or other kinds of sociology, I think that's going to be the new edge of the conversation. I will say finally, that in cases in Australia, in the UK, and in Canada so far, that have considered the propriety of lifting the criminal prohibitions against polygamy, the arguments from harm, which I locate in ancient forms in the West, but are rearticulated in new forms today in the way that I try to summarize them, those arguments from harm have been sufficient to convince courts to leave the criminal laws in place. And the argument from harm in the most recent case in Canada, in the British Columbia Supreme Court that just heard a case last year, is an argument purely from harm, and it could have come right out of William of Orange's arguments. Other questions, other comments?
Thank you. You've presented the case against, but are there, and you've made some allusions to this during your talk, you've talked about Augustine, for example, who, at least from the natural point of view, didn't see any harm in polygamy. Is there any other people who have argued for polygamy throughout history? Or, you know, you've also talked a little bit about that, but could you elaborate?
Sure. There is a ongoing narrative in the tradition favoring polygamy. And every time it comes up, it gets crushed, but it keeps on coming back. And the arguments are, in part, arguments about self-determination. Why should we have one prescribed norm for representing our intimate relationships with others? Why should the church, why should the state, why should society condone a particular form of intimacy when other forms of intimacy are just as effective in both self-fulfillment as well as in the good of procreation? And if I am a man with sufficient means and I'm capable physically to maintain 3 or 4 or 5 wives, why should I not be able to? After all, Abraham did. After all, David did. After all, Solomon did. I should be able to too. And why are the titans of virtue in the Bible held up for many things as exemplary, but on this are dismissed as inappropriate? Why should we be selective in the normative characterization of their life story? That's one, and that's a big one, and that's an ancient one that goes to the tradition, and that's the one of sexual liberty and sexual privacy today. Second argument is an argument in the Christian tradition. And the argument in the Christian tradition basically says there is nothing against polygamy in the Bible anywhere. And it's not that the Bible is sparing in sexual morality norms. Every possible piece of fornication and transvestism and all the wild stuff that we think about today, the Bible singles out and says, you may not. But nowhere does the Bible ever say, thou shalt not have 2 or more wives. Right? There is the story of Genesis, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh. It doesn't say wife, it says woman. And it's repeated a few times, but look, there is a recognition that a person can cleave with another. Deuteronomy 21 makes provision for inheritance of polygamous households. The Bible, as a consequence, condones polygamy, is the argument. And you can hear that argument echoing constantly in tradition. It's an argument that you see in the 3rd and 4th and 5th century experiments in some of the new Christian heretical communities. It's an argument in 12th and 13th century monastic communities, interestingly, that practice polygamy. It's the argument of the 16th century that emerges amongst Anabaptists. The notion is that the Bible doesn't prohibit it. The Bible calls us all to be fruitful and multiply. I'd like to do that more efficiently, thank you. And the third argument is an argument it's an argument of necessity. And the argument of necessity basically says that, look, sometimes communities are decimated. They're decimated by flood, they're decimated by plague, they're decimated by pestilence, they're decimated by a lot of things, warfare and other things. And it's much more efficient, and nature foreordains this. It's much more efficient for a man to have multiple wives because a man can produce multiple children. A man can have sex with 9 women in one night and have 9 children. A woman can have sex with 9 men and have but 1 child. It's just natural to more efficiently reproduce by having polygamous unions. And rather than making this something that is illicit through prostitution or fornication or adultery or concubinage, why not make it more effectively a form of marriage? If men are going to do it anyway, is the more cynical version of that argument, you might as well have them do it within the confines of marriage. And then I think the final argument that we're hearing today is the argument that this is just Western smugness. And Western smugness is helpful, but it's certainly not a cogent argument in the face of the reality that there are 1,264 cultures. My sociologist friend can correct me, but the last I've read, 1,264 cultures that have or do practice polygamy. And some of them are rather sophisticated, thank you, and the Muslims in particular are very sophisticated. And the Prophet understood that there were limits upon polygamy which he imposed, 3 or 4 depending on one's capacity and one's economic means, but that it was a perfectly appropriate way of procreating. And who are we in the West, and who are we in America with our constitutional norms open to everyone? Who are we to be saying that one smug version of the Western understanding of monogamy has to be superimposed on everyone else? There are a lot of sophisticated cultures that have done other things, thank you, and the notion that monogamous marriage is the cornerstone of civilization is just sociologically false. And why not, as we globalize, why not as we think about alternative forms of marriage, why not as we think about sexual liberty in all of its forms, why not have this as an additional model? It's a fairer way, it's a more inclusive way, it's a welcoming way, and it finally uncovers the Western smugness and passes it aside. All those arguments are floating around, and the book that's coming out is long because in part I'm trying to credit all those arguments along the way. Please. Yep.
In Jewish law, how did that move away from polygamy?
Yep. So the Mormon Church's move, I think, is a perfect case of First Amendmentization of religion. Religion bending toward the legal light. And in this instance, it was largely the U.S. Supreme Court and the federal authorities on the territories that were pummeling the Mormon Church into rethinking its position. And ultimately, it was a question of survival of the church or rejection of this institution that was not considered to be central. The argument was that polygamy was useful for salvation, but it wasn't essential for salvation and was jettisoned. The argument in the Jewish tradition crystallizes in the 10th and 11th century of the Common Era, some would say in the 12th. Judaism, by reason of these Hebrew Bible texts, by reason of the Torah and the provisions of inheritance for polygamous families, always had a small practice of polygamy from biblical times until the 11th century, notwithstanding Roman persecution, Germanic persecution, and Christian persecution in the first millennium and into the early second. The arguments that eventually convinced the rabbis to change are the arguments I've just trotted out. The argument from harm, and the worry about women, the worry about children, the worry about men not being ready to take on the responsibilities of polygamous households, and the worry especially, and this is Gershon's famous argument, the worry especially that when you produce disproportionate numbers of children that become wards of the community, especially when persecuted, has no means to uphold the life of those children. The more effective way, the more efficient way, the fairer way of reproduction is through one man, one woman. It's not an argument of lofty theological insight. It's not an argument really of a sharp new revelation as occurred with Woodruff in the Mormon Church. It's an argument really of gradual weighing of the costs and benefits of polygamy and ultimately coming to the conclusion that this institution simply is not one that we can countenance any longer. It's unfair to women and children especially. There is a persistent small streak of Jewish polygamy that continues into the 20th and 21st century, especially manifest in Jews in Yemen. And those are now giving the Jewish authorities in Israel fits because they're not quite sure what to do with them. So let me just say one more thing, which is as our first questioner's question raises, this is not an easy slam dunk. This is not like slavery, or cannibalism or something of that sort. It's a closer call in the understanding of norms of sexual intimacy and domestic relationship. And as a consequence, the law in this posture really is being forced out of a thou shalt and thou shalt not mode, much more into a soft law mode of nudging, encouraging, facilitating, supporting, exemplifying, modeling certain kinds of behavior without prescribing it monogamously, and in turn trying to discourage, to inhibit a bit, to not make popular the idea of polygamy, but increasingly, even though it says thou shalt not, really not enforcing those norms anymore. And I think we're moving from a hard law to a soft law position on this, and I think that the reason for that is the moral ambiguity and cultural ambiguity that still attaches to that institution in the eyes of many, notwithstanding the kind of malum in se reflex that a lot of folk have. Other questions? I got 3 in a row here. I have my former student here. If I may, I will get her. She was very smart, and I'm in trouble, I know.
Is some of that shift from the modern divorce laws of making it so that there really are kind of anonymous sequential polygamists now, is that changing how people think about polygamy?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, the reality is that that was one part of the anti-polygamy piece in the past, right? It was not just you should not have 2 wives at the same time. You may not have 2 wives in a row either. The idea is that you could not remarry unless and until your first spouse was dead. And the idea there was serial polygamy, or digamy as it was called, and it was part of a bigger package. And so there's no question that not only with the forms of marriage pluralizing to include same-sex couples, but also the reality of marriage itself changing into a more transient institution that includes 2nd, 3rd, and 4th wives seriatim has eroded the credibility of the old argument of exclusive monogamy alone, no question. Madam. We have 3 in a row up here, so you can leave it up here. Thank you.
I'm really intrigued by the fact that one of the times when the arguments resurfaced was because of Anabaptist practice of polygamy, and I am an Anabaptist, not a polygamist, but modern day. And I suspect that some of their rationale was more about the communitarian formation in addition to biblical non-prohibition. And so then I wonder, is there any tracking of polygamy as a practice kind of coinciding with times when societal structures maybe are breaking down to offer? And so is our current conversation on one of those tracks as well?
Yeah, nice question, apropos of your colleague's question just a moment ago. There is no question in the 16th century the world was turned upside down by the Reformation. Luther was throwing out all these ancient institutions that had been in place and vouchsafed by the Catholic Church for 5 centuries, formally supported by the canon law, enforced by the church courts, and a rigorous part of this the way things were in the West. Here Luther is throwing everything aside. Luther is saying, well, of course you don't have to have clerical celibacy. Priests and nuns can get married, and here I'm going to marry Catherine, I'm a former monk and she's a former nun. Of course we can have divorce, and of course we can have remarriage after divorce, and of course we should have sexual pleasure, and of course we should remove all of these inhibitions upon the sexual life that have been imposed by this perfectionist ethic of the confession. And boy, in that context, when all of a sudden you're ripping apart millennium-long interpretations that have been carefully stitched together and vouchsafed in the canon law, and throwing those aside and burning them, indeed, in the Wittenberg fires in 1520, it becomes very easy for the community to say, well, if we're going to throw everything else aside for the sake of biblical truth, let's try again. And now it's back to my question, my answer to our colleague here, right? Because the argument becomes, well, look, the Bible is supposed to be our great textbook. Luther said so, sola scriptura. Back to the Bible, freed from the canon law, freed from all the medieval theology, freed from all this casuistic argument. What's the Bible say? Well, Shazam. You may have polygamy. And we're following the Hebrew Bible's Old Testament, the great Hebrew Bible patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Elkanah, and all these other guys, 17 of them. We think it's fine. New Testament doesn't say anything different. we think it's fine. Secondly, we think it's a good thing, expedient, because what do we have? We have a tiny little Anabaptist community, and we are trying to be the true light of the world. Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, Catholics, let alone Jews and Muslims, they are all denigrated. They are all reprobate. They are all given up on the gospel. We are true gospel believers, and as true gospel believers, we need to proliferate ourselves quickly. Number three, there's a dispensationalism in this. And the dispensationalism argument is basically, if we get 144,000 of us, as quickly as possible, we'll be freed from all the persecution that has been visited on us, which was relentlessly issued against them by Catholics and by Protestants. They were viciously persecuted in a number of different quarters. And their argument became an argument, we read the Bible literally, that says when 144,000 saints have been gathered, Jesus will come back. Come on back, and we're going to get you here as fast as possible by having polygamy. And then fourth, there is very much a charismatic, John of Leyden, who organizes the Münster community. He walks in with a very suave Dutch lilt and persuades all of these wonderful Anabaptists to accept his understanding of the truth. And very charismatic, small community, just converted from Catholicism to Lutheranism and now to the true way. And he persuades the community to follow him at their peril eventually, and ultimately at the destruction of 20,000 people. But that is what's going on in that community. They're not the only ones in Münster that are the Anabaptists practicing it. Anabaptists in a number of different quarters. We think George Hunston Williams, who knows this stuff better than anybody, estimates 2,637 polygamous men. Exactly how many women, we don't know, in the first half of the 16th century. The Anabaptists eventually renounced this as a misinterpretation of Scripture and an inexpedient way to continue to try to survive as a young community in Christian, Protestant, and Catholic Europe. And they renounce it. It's an early First Amendmentizing, a kind of bending to the legal light that emerges. And by 1555, there's not an Anabaptist on the continent that I know of that is condoning or practicing polygamy any longer. Those that had have been killed or have renounced the practice. But it is exactly a textbook case of when the community is in turmoil, when old norms are up for grabs, when new ideas are beginning to instantiate themselves into new institutional practices, absolutely polygamy always comes back. 12th century, same thing. 16th century again. 19th century again. Second Great Awakening, right? We have Pentecostals, holiness churches, all kinds of cool new communities. Everybody's kind of strutting it out. And here's another opportunity to practice polygamy. It's a normal part of community transitions, no question. The hardest one by Professor
Not
Levin.
necessarily, because it is in fact the mirror image of the previous question, which is so is there a real argument against polygamy as a continuing practice? We get some sense of the kinds of conditions under which it arises, but when Thomas Aquinas is arguing against it, I get the sense that he's sort of working through the logical possibilities, right? You can have one woman with many men and one man with many women, and so forth. But he's rejecting those things on kind of logical grounds. Is he in fact arguing against anybody who is arguing for polygamy, or is that simply a way of constructing a doctrine of marriage for normal times?
It's both, but I will say that he is trained with Raymond of Penafort. And Raymond is a Spanish who's been sitting right on the edge of Christendom and the Muslim world in southern Spain, and spends most of his life dealing with both Muslim and scattered Jewish communities that are still left in Spain, each of them practicing polygamy, and each of them, under his Raymond's view, in need of a cogent argument to demonstrate to them that this is wrong. He's the one that instructs his Dominican brother Thomas Aquinas, to write the Summa contra Gentiles. It's the Summa not contrary to the Gentiles, it's a Summa that is describing the truths of the Christian faith to the people, the gens, the Gentiles, which are the Jews and Muslims of his day. And it's the Summa contra Gentiles, not the Summa Theologica, where Thomas lays out this argument. And he's laying it out in part as an answer to the persistent practice of polygamy in some of the philosophical quarters that he's inherited, yes, but especially the empirical realities of polygamy as he has had them reported to him by the William of Oranges and others, by Raymond of Pennafort, his father superior, and by the realities that across the Mediterranean, in Spain, in the Middle East, as reported regularly to him, polygamy persists. And finally, what informs his most powerful arguments are that Albert the Great, his teacher, has just written this big 7-volume history of animals. Massive empirical, such as it was, observation about the way critters go through the reproductive process. And what Aquinas is trying to do is to say, this natural philosophy, if we're going to have something called natural law or some kind of arguments from human nature, we're going to have to be able to take into account the comparison between humans and other animals, including what we would call higher primates. And why do we construct our institutions the way we construct them? Why is that different from? How is a rational being informed by conscience and with capacity of synderesis to translate that into new, proper, rational terms that foster the common good, how can we begin to construct a reproductive system that works? And it's those things together, the philosophical responses to a long-standing argument, the empirical observations of polygamy around the world, including in 2 sophisticated communities that he is trying to reach out to, and an attempt to create a natural biological argument that he moves to this formulation of the natural foundations of sacramental marriage. And this is only a piece of the story. He then goes on in the elaborate argument about the mystery of faith and the sacrament of marriage and what that all means, and that just gives him further spiritual buttressing for an argument that he has already constructed on rational and natural and observational terms. Whether convincing, we'll leave that. Some of our colleagues would say yes, some of our colleagues would say no. But what's interesting is his argument, that argument of the Summa contra Gentiles, oftentimes camouflaged, oftentimes never attributed to him, becomes a part of every person who takes seriously the conversation about polygamy for the next 700 years. I can find American common law jurists, I can find Supreme Court justices, I can find William Blackstone, I can find John Locke, I can find all the guys who repeat that argument constantly. It just becomes kind of just an obvious argument, a psychology 101 argument that has to be used in the tradition.
I'm afraid we need to bring this conversation, the formal part, to a close, but please continue the informal conversation and join us for a reception in the back. And let's thank our speaker.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.